Everybody. Welcome to the Frontline Club, and thank you for coming tonight for tonight's discussion, which is very topical with the news that I'm sure Sam has just been reporting, which is why he's a little bit late. Before I hand over to Sam Kiley, who is the international editor for Sky?
Foreign Affairs.
Foreign Affairs editor.
Rather loaded
If I can
title.
just ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we're broadcasting live. So over to Sam.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I do apologise for keeping you waiting, but it is all in the best possible topical interests of us all, because for those of you who don't know, David Cameron announced at 6 o'clock today that he will be recalling Parliament in order to discuss or have a vote upon a motion that will propose allowing for the RAF to be used in combat operations. We don't know whether it is exclusively to Iraq or whether it will include Syria. Although, as I was saying so brilliantly earlier on Sky, this is probably will be restricted to to Iraq because of the loaded history of votes on Syria. But that remains to be seen. Anyway, so I apologise for being late, but that at least brings you bang up to date with this, what I think is an absolutely fascinating subject, and I'm very, very excited to be on this, to be chairing this panel rather than participating in it as an expert, because I simply don't know enough to make that claim. But the four panelists we have here really are, in their own ways, very expert on the problem of Islamism or Islamist, Islamofascism in general, and on the Islamic State or Islamic State, which goes by a variety of names. We call it Islamic State at Sky. So without banging on any further, I'll introduce each member of the panel, then I'll ask each member in the order that they're introduced, just because it happens to be on this piece of paper that way. Speak for 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll have a panel chat, and then we'll open it up to 5 questions. 3 to 5?
Yeah.
3 if you're boring, 5 if you're really good.
Okay.
It's like Britain's Got Talent.
Yeah, exactly. Except that I'm, if you think Simon Cowell's a bit of a bastard, you ain't seen nothing yet. No, I'm only kidding. Millicent, she ran away already.
She fled.
Okay, well, I don't know how long this is going to go on for, so we'll just let it go on as long as it likes. So, on my right is Peter Newman. Now, he is a regular contributor to the media because he is Professor of Security Studies at the Department of War Studies at King's College London, and he's the Director of the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation, which is a relatively new body, but one that is, believe you me, flat out, not least in answering some pretty stupid questions from people like me. Then we have, on my far left here, is Ayman Jawad Al-Tamimi. He's a student at Brasenose.
Graduated.
Sorry, you're graduated?
I graduated.
Oh, congratulations. Well, you should be wearing a funny hat or something. He's a recent graduate of Brasenose, which I prefer to call Brazennose College. And he's a Shulman Ginsburg Fellow at the Middle East Forum. He focuses on developments in Syria and Iraq, and he's a prolific Twitterer,
Yeah.
twerp.
And translator.
A translator, yes, exactly. Which is, in fact, the first time we've encountered each other in real life, but we occasionally exchanged twerps,
Yeah.
whatever it is. Patrick, it almost needs no introduction. He's Middle East correspondent since 1979, since most people here probably weren't even born then. He was on the FT. He indeed worked with my father on the Financial Times and the Independent. He's the author of numerous books on Islamic State. It's available for download. It's extremely good value. Oh, and there's even a hard copy too. Brilliant. Marvellous. I've already bought mine. If I'd only known I was going to get a freebie. I assume that was a freebie.
No, I would have.
And last but by no means least is Dr. Ali Brahimi, who's a visiting research fellow at Oxford, I'm pleased to say, at the Oxford University Changing Character of War programme at Pembroke College. And it's going to be a fascinating area that I'm going to enjoy exploring with you, because one of the things I've noticed nothing to do with this debate, but with reference to Ukraine, there's a different labelling to old-fashioned insurgency that's come up with. Hybrid warfare is suddenly, you know, when you get bitten in the bum, you don't react to it, you just give it a new name and react with surprise, it seems to me. So, having done the introductions, if we could start with you, Peter, since I started with you, and if you could just give us, I suppose, from your perspective, a sense of how on earth this organisation has been able to be born and then grow so fast.
It's very difficult to explain that. I think there are a number of factors coming together. I think that one of the key factors explaining why ISIS has been so successful so rapidly and why it surprised everyone in the West is because they very effectively ridden the sectarian tiger in that region. And ultimately, of course, the reason why they enjoy a lot of support in places like Iraq, for example, is not necessarily because they think about that group the way we think about that group, but because they see it as a very powerful defense against their sectarian adversaries. The point I wanted to make in the introduction really is a wider point, though, which is that I believe that as is going to take a lot longer than we now believe, and that's for two reasons. Number one, because I do not believe that the air campaign that is currently happening in that particular region is going to be able to defeat ISIS. I also don't think that necessarily a more intensive military campaign is going to do that job. So we're going to be down there for a very long time, probably years rather than months. And also, more importantly almost, I think the fact that this conflict has attracted so many foreign fighters is going to cause problems down the line. We believe, and other people believe, that over the past 3 years, between 12 and 15,000 people have gone to Syria and now to Iraq as foreign fighters. If you compare that historically, it is probably the greatest foreign fighter mobilization since the Afghanistan war in the 1980s. It will not take long until it overtakes the Afghanistan conflict in the 1980s, which is believed to have mobilized 20,000 people. So we're not far off. We of course know that the Afghanistan conflict created these international networks, one of which was Al-Qaeda. And I think that the 15,000 people that have gone there now and that may go to other conflicts, may go back to their home countries, may stay in the region, they are constituting perhaps a new generation of jihadist networks that will perhaps keep us busy for another generation. So I think that is from our point of view, really the long-term effect of that conflict. And that's why I'm confident that we will be looking at this for a long time to come.
Fascinating. Who's next on the list?
I'd actually like to explore like a more specific angle, the Iraq angle. Why it is that ISIS has emerged, or it's now the Islamic State. Why has it emerged out on top, or seemingly so dominant within Iraq? And it's important to remember that the Islamic State has ridden on the back of an overall revitalized Sunni Arab insurgency within Iraq. I mean, we had in the days of the Iraq War, we had a Sunni insurgency. It was very, very diverse. I mean, Al-Qaeda in Iraq which was a predecessor of the Islamic State, was an important component. But much of the fighting was focused on this idea of, particularly among the Sunni Arab insurgency, of liberating Baghdad from the new government. And one thing that really helped to change that factor on the ground, that led to that Sahwa movement that's been talked about so often, that pushed back against what was the previous incarnation of the Islamic State after Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Islamic State of Iraq, was the fact that most of the mixed areas in Baghdad had been ethnically cleansed of Sunnis, and the Sunni insurgency increasingly came to realize, actually, if we continue at this, we're going to keep on losing ground, and so turn to a third-party actor, the Americans, the coalition forces, to form the Sahwa movement that really pushed back against the Islamic State of Iraq. But of course, it never actually quite died away. They were still conducting attacks even at the very end of 2011, kill at least a couple hundred people a month in attacks. But I mean, it's of course nowhere near the scale it was now. But they persisted, and then, you know, going into the aftermath of the US withdrawal, actually, there were signs actually of further Sunni Arab acceptance of working within the political system and, you know, trying to push through for demands. To give an example, the Islamic Army in Iraq was one of the components of the insurgency. It's now gone back to armed struggle, and if you talk to their guys, they're a nationalist group. They talk now in revolutionary terms about overthrowing the central government. But what they'd actually done immediately after the US withdrawal was to set up their own activist front, the Sunni Popular Movement, which was designed to push for a Sunni federal region. You had the arrest Maliki tried to move against Rafi al-Isawi, he was the Sunni finance minister. You then had these ongoing problems. There was no longer the US. Security forces reverted to these heavy-handed policies, like in Iraq, it reverted to these heavy-handed policies like mass arrests, arbitrary detentions, and so on. And that's what then erupted into the Sunni Arab protest movement of 2013. And then in which you actually saw some of the other insurgent brands, like, for example, the Ba'athist Sufi Jaysh Rujal al-Tariq and Naqshbandi army. They linked to the ex-Ba'ath party. They had their own activist wings campaigning on the ground. But what they were really after was trying to push for a renewal of armed insurgency. You know, sure enough, there were two incidents I'd point to in 2013 then sparked what we have now in 2014, which is this overall revitalization. The first is the government moved in on a protest site in Hawija, this is in Kirkuk province, which was dominated by Naqshbandi army protesters, but they were unarmed, and then the government ended up killing dozens of them. And then secondly, you had what Maliki, who was then the Iraqi prime minister, he did in the end of 2013. He said that the Ramadi protest site in Anbar was the site of was a hiding camp for ISIS. But of course, I mean, he didn't really have anything to substantiate that. But nonetheless, it was also a useful rallying point, actually, in light of the upcoming elections that took place earlier this year. And that ended in a debacle. Chaos broke out. He withdrew the army from Anbar, and then this is the context in which IS and other groups moved into Fallujah, which fell out of government control. You had the fighting ongoing in Fallujah, and then we've had all these events since, like the fall of Mosul and so on. As I say, IS rode in on the back of that, revitalized it. However, it is true that in the majority of towns that have fallen, IS either spearheaded the initial attack that led to the fall of these towns, or it's been the case that it's just been them alone. So what we have now is a situation where all the towns in western Anbar, and this goes in with IS's contiguous territory stretching into Syria, they're solely controlled by IS. Fallujah was a gradual process where IS has gradually subsumed other factions under its control. And then they've pushed others out to the peripheries. Mosul, again, multiple factions are involved, but IS has gradually asserted its power over time, and then other factions either give allegiance to IS or they just disappear and go underground. So then, one question we have is, going forward, we mentioned airstrikes, but can these actually push back the Islamic State within Iraq? I don't think so. Really, the fundamental question we have to deal now as well is with the Sunni-Shia relations within Iraq and how exactly they determine the balance of their relationship within Iraq. And as I say, one problem we have is that large parts of Sunni insurgency readopted this idea that they should be ruling the country because they either believe themselves to be the demographic plurality or majority. And you see, people talk about, in the West, talk about, say, a political solution, say, well, we give the Sunni provinces more autonomy. When you have the other insurgents, the non-IS ones, saying, this only solution is revolution, we don't even want to mention IS by name, despite the various things it's done, like displacement of Christians from Mosul or the attacks on Yazidis in Sinjar, then that's really a problem. You have this, there's an incoherent sense of what does the Sunni side want. And then even if you have the Sunni side, the Sunni insurgency moderating its demands and saying, actually, no, what we want is autonomous provinces and so on, there's still a general reluctance within the Shia political spectrum to meet such demands, like reforming de-Baathification or granting autonomy, given how much problem there's been with the autonomous Kurdistan region and the central government in Baghdad. So really, I am pessimistic about, the efficacy of just carrying out airstrikes. It can hold back the Islamic State, but really I think what has to come about is a change of mindsets within on the ground, and just as we shouldn't underestimate the importance of local actors behind the initial pushback against the Islamic State of Iraq back in the days of the Iraq War. So, it's also local mindsets that matter here in Iraq now.
Fascinating, thank you. Patrick?
Sure, no, that's very interesting, and I completely agree with Eamon. Why did all this happen? Why did Iraq, having gone through this appalling war from 2003 on, why did it reignite? Well, now these days it's all blamed on Nouri al-Maliki, with some reason, perhaps one of the worst prime ministers of any country in history. But I say that after careful thought. And many contenders. But persecution of the Sunni villages outside Fallujah, you'd find half the young men had disappeared. Where were they? They were in jail. You'd find Sunni young men were on death row, going to be executed for a crime for which somebody else had already been executed. So this was extreme persecution, denial of jobs, everything else. But that isn't actually, I think, why we have ISIS in the present situation. That the real turning point, I think, was the uprising in Syria. That the Sunni in Iraq, though they felt persecuted, though peaceful protest was mutating into armed resistance, what really made the difference was the uprising primarily of the Sunni in Syria, and the Sunni Arabs in Syria are over 60% of the population, as opposed to around 20% in Iraq, that this changed the sectarian balance in the region, that the Sunni in Iraq were enthused, that suddenly the political geography seemed to be changing in their direction, in their favor, and that precipitated what happened. Why did it go on in Syria? Well, there I think the Western governments and foreign governments are very culpable. Negotiations to end the war in Syria in Geneva II earlier this year. It was only the Americans, the others wanted it to be about Assad leaving power. But since Assad controlled 13 out of 14 Syrian provincial capitals, he obviously wasn't going to leave power. So what in fact was presented as a peace negotiations was really a recipe for the war continuing. And I think that there was a feeling in Western capitals and among the Sunni monarchies that they didn't like either side who was fighting, and they didn't really mind that war going on, despite the great floods of crocodile tears that Cameron and Obama and all the others have been emitting over the last few years. They thought that this really wouldn't affect the rest of the world. But in Baghdad during that period, if you talk to ministers, I remember talking to Hosha Zebari, the foreign minister, said, if this goes on, the war goes on in Syria, it's going to destabilize Iraq. Iraq is shaky, but things might continue as they were. It was the war in Syria, which I think was the factor which finally reignited this terrible war in Iraq. What happens now? For a time after the fall of Mosul, there was a sort of comforting belief that this was going to be a brief period, that the ISIS was simply the shock troops of the Sunni community. Down the road, offer the Sunni a deal, autonomy, whatever, and they'll get rid of ISIS. It seemed to me, you had to be very young and very stupid to believe this, because ISIS, what do we know about them? Incredibly violent, incredibly paranoid, waiting for a stab in the back. Is it likely they're going to let this happen, since they think it happened before in 2007? Not very likely. Another factor is the Sunni communities in Syria and Iraq frequently don't like ISIS, are frightened of them, but they're also frightened of the government. They're very frightened in Mosul. I have friends in Mosul whom I'm in touch with by email, And they're very frightened of the government and the Shia militias coming back. They're very frightened that this is going to be worse than ISIS, that they're going to get their throats cut, that all the men are going to be tortured, and so forth. And the same is true in Syria. They're frightened of Assad and of the Syrian army and Assad's militias coming back. So this gives a support to ISIS, which is really quite important. Like Ayman, I think that this war is going to go on a long time. Could it be any different? I think there are things that could be done, certainly in Syria, should have been done. If the Syrian moderates are so important, and Syrian moderates are armed moderates are a bit difficult to find on the map, then maybe the moment has come to arrange a truce between them and Assad's forces. At least have some sort of ceasefire in Syria that can reduce the present level of violence and the enormous number of refugees. But anyway, we can talk about these things later, so let me end it there.
Thank you, Patrick. Well, you've been listening, you know, nodding and being very kind.
Well, I agree actually with what Patrick was just saying, that there sort of has to be another game in town, given the causes behind this phenomenon that we're seeing. And a negotiated kind of political settlement to the Syrian conflict is definitely a part of that. I think that what the US and the coalition is trying to do is cut ISIS off kind of on the at the head, whereas you need to kind of cut them off at the legs and isolate them from their support base and really deal with the fundamental problems. And I think that that's not possible without dealing with the political crisis in Syria. And I think that goes back to what Ayman was saying about how Maliki's many have definitely played a part in creating the ISIS that we see today. So both in Syria and in Iraq, both Maliki and Assad have attempted to apply military solutions to what are fundamentally political crises. And I think that that's why that is one of the main reasons why ISIS not only exists but is as strong as it is today, apart from the Iraq War, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which I think is a massively important factor. So I think that, again, buying into that notion that you can deal with this political problem militarily isn't particularly helpful and is instructive to us. Just the founding of ISIS and the way it's come about is instructive to us, should be at least. But I wanted to position ISIS within the broader context of Al-Qaeda just briefly, and just raise the issue of the fragmentation of Islamic authority, or Al-Qaeda's authority. So after 9/11, with the globalization of jihad, Osama bin Laden found that his personal authority was at the very same time, far-reaching, but also fragmented, fundamentally fragmented. So he'd opened up the arena of Islamic interpretation. He argued for waging jihad independently of the political and religious establishment, but he was unable to claim a monopoly over this process himself. And so what you saw were a bunch of affiliated groups, loosely affiliated groups, who became mired in this kind of localized sectarian violence, and bin Laden was unable to stop them. So what tended to happen was that groups were focused. Bin Laden wanted to focus on the far enemy, what he calls the far enemy, the US and its allies. And traditionally, jihadis had focused on the near enemy. That's the authoritarian governments in the region that were said to be ruling over Muslims with an iron fist. But what happens after 9/11 was a lot of Al-Qaeda affiliated groups were focusing on what I call the nearer enemy, that is impure society, local enemies, Shia, Christian, Yazidis, Sunnis deemed insufficiently pious, and often engaged in sort of killing for killing's sake, because the perverse reality of a globalized Al-Qaeda was actually an increasingly localized one. And this reality brought Al-Qaeda to the brink of strategic crisis in 2010, 2011. In that context, the declaration of the caliphate by ISIS in June, it seems to imply some sort of sense of political religious unity. But the story is actually one of deep division within Sunni radical Islam. Hence, the very public disputes between Zawahiri and Baghdadi, and the splits within various Al-Qaeda branches since then. So that's the point about the fragmentation of authority, and it will only accelerate. That's the trajectory. My second point is that Al-Qaeda after bin Laden, at first glance, there's a spectrum. So at one end, you have Al-Qaeda in Yemen, AQAP. the creatures of Osama bin Laden, very much focused on attacking the West, a learning organization, and seemingly on the other end you have groups like ISIS, born in the sectarian killing fields in Iraq and Syria. But what we're seeing now is the potential for these different preoccupations to come together under one umbrella. And I think that's what ISIS represents. So having honed its fighting skills against the near enemies in Baghdad and Damascus, and having earned a reputation for unrivaled brutality against civilians that it deemed the nearer enemy, Obama is right. ISIS will certainly branch out into far enemy jihad. The focus now is more on sort of proto-state building, but I do think that it's a matter of time. And because of these ineluctable kind of leadership rivalries, I think Baghdadi will very much relish in straying on to Ayman al-Zawahiri's home ground. And we can't forget that conducting an attack against the West, particularly a large-scale one, it has this dual ability to energize the ranks, re-energize the ranks, and also to silence internal critics. So I think that Baghdadi and Zawahiri at the moment are in a race, to do that, to effect that. And of course, Zawahiri has the added problem that he doesn't control any territory. To that end, I think the drawdown in Afghanistan becomes significant, because I think they will try in Kunar and Nuristan provinces to establish something they can claim as an emirate. And then he can be seen as, in a position to be challenging Baghdadi's authority. Because the discourse now on radical forums and within some of the Salafi jihadi community is that Zawahiri has no right to be telling Baghdadi anything. What territory does he control? So the onus comes upon him and people in the Al-Qaeda old guard to actually seize some territory. So there's very much an important rivalry there that is going to shape the policies of both groups. And I think that it's internal rivalries that will implicate Western targets. It's the settling of those disputes in the future. But my point was that ISIS is new in the way in which it presents this simultaneous threat to society, state, and the West. But that's ideologically. Capability is another question.
Delighted that you brought us to this point, because I was thinking, oh my God, then nobody's going to talk about the external threat as posed, and given that the argument being made for airstrikes by those who are in favour of them is that Islamic State poses a threat. And then I note with interest that top of the target list was actually the so-called Khorasan group, which isn't part of Islamic State anyway. It's a sort of offshoot of the al-Nusra group, or
it's
Al-Qaeda
part of
veteran.
Nusra.
Yeah, depending on how you want to do it. But it's certainly not an Islamic
Nusra
State
part of?
movement. Yeah, exactly, the chicken and egg. Peter, is the sense of fear being spread by the leadership in the West, notably Obama today at the United Nations General Assembly? No doubt David Cameron will make a similar sort of call to arms when he speaks later on tonight, our time. Your institution studies the noise coming, a lot of the noise, and deconstruct it coming out of Islamic State. Are they starting to look for an external target? Is there a kind of race, an arms race, and a race for an external target for a far war operation?
All right. So I think addressing your question, but also addressing some of the things that Alia said, I think one of the reasons why ISIS has been so successful and also different from Al-Qaeda is because it had a different strategy. Not necessarily a different ideology, but a different strategy. Whereas Al-Qaeda focused very much, like the hallmark of Al-Qaeda was to overthrow Bashar Assad. But ISIS said, let's not do that. We don't care about Bashar Assad so much. We're going to set up our state. We're going to start a state. We're going to hold territory. Then we're going to live from that territory. We're going to recruit people from within that territory. We're going to raise money from within that territory. We're going to expand that state. We're going to do our own thing. And I think that is a different strategic approach from Al-Qaeda. And for a long time, until recently, for ISIS, attacking the West was not a priority. It doesn't mean they like the West. Still, of course, the ideology says they're very hostile to the West, but it was not a priority for them to launch attacks against the West. And that's why the Americans are quite right in saying that possibly in the short term, the bigger danger comes from Al-Qaeda or from Khorasan or whatever offshoot or part of al-Nusra they are referring to, that is the immediate priority because they are still focused on attacking the West in the short term. The medium to long term, of course, ISIS does represent a threat. And we do already see people in Western countries like Australia who are sympathizing with ISIS saying, you know, America is attacking us, we're going to do things on our own now. I don't think that is necessarily coming from the ISIS leadership, but there are certainly people who are feeling encouraged, inspired, and to some extent legitimate in pursuing that sort of strategy. And so I do think in the short term, Al-Qaeda is the bigger threat. The medium to long term, of course, we have to recognize the power of IS and the fact that so many people have gone there and networks are emerging, which in the long term, over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, may turn against the West. So that would be my analysis.
Do you agree with that?
I agree. I'm not sure I agree with all of it. I think that ISIS is much the biggest threat, but it's a much bigger organization. You know, I think that Western leaders were, to extent, find it much easier to think about Al-Qaeda because it's pretty small. You know, it centers somewhere in the mountains of Pakistan or elsewhere in Pakistan, or there they are down in Yemen. It's all, you know, politicians kind of like a threat because it increases their authority. They don't like it being that big. ISIS is a very big organization. And I think that people talk about, you know, people returning jihadis, deciding they're going to do their thing and kill somebody. I think probably the biggest threat that ISIS interacts with the world through violence. Do something to them, they do something to you. You could see that with the ritual murder of the 2 American journalists and my colleagues and the British aid worker. So will they respond as an organization, and a very effective organization? I think that's what should be the concern. Something that Al-Qaeda couldn't really do, didn't have that organized power. There's sort of talk of, you know, attacking the homeland in America, Little House in the Prairie, or something in London. I mean, 2.5 million British tourists go to Turkey every year, you know. You don't have to go that far. If they run out of Brits who they picked up in Syria or elsewhere, they can certainly pick them up in Turkey. So the threat is there, but I think this sort of emphasis, I'd like to hear what Ayman thinks of this on Khorasan. It's politically convenient because anybody launching a war, you want to impress the voter back home that it's not just a war in a distant place, but those fellows are coming after you. You know, the person living in Basingstoke, or Missouri, or wherever it is. So groups like Khorasan fulfill a political function and are worth emphasizing, indeed exaggerating their strength. But I'd like to hear what Ayman thinks about this group. Is this PR or is it real?
It is actually PR, and actually I think disinformation. It was like fed to the New York Times and then spread to other news outlets. Khorasan is really actually just people from Al-Qaeda and the Afghanistan-Pakistan who've just happened to have come to Syria. And, you know, that's hardly an unknown phenomenon. You know, I've seen sometimes on social media talk about Khorasanis pledging Bay'ah's allegiance to what was then ISIS, Islamic State in Iraq and Asham. With regards actually to what I think was the US created this Khorasan designation to try to disguise, or a rather poor attempt to disguise the fact that they're also attacking Nusra in Syria because they know Nusra has support on the ground, and secondly, a lot of the groups the US would like to support, ultimately in the hope of building a rebel army of some kind, actually work with Nusra. So, like, for example, in southern Syria, in Deraa, on the border with the Golan Heights, the Southern Front, which is this Free Syrian Army banner coalition, works with Jabhat al-Nusra. Problem is actually this hasn't now the airstrikes have happened. This hasn't quite worked out for the US in terms of whatever they hope to achieve with this PR thing, because you see actually that even the US-backed FSA banner group called Harakat Hizm, which is a northern outfit, they condemned the attacks as a violation of sovereignty. Now, I suspect that actually if the US had gone and just targeted the Islamic State alone, they wouldn't have said anything, because Harakat Hizm's played up very big this idea about attacking ISIS, being the force to fight against IS. And you see other Western-backed rebel potential Western partners, particularly FSA banner, have played up this idea too, like the Syrian Revolutionaries Front. But then when you get onto Nusra, a lot of them just get a lot more ambiguous about it. So Jamal Maruf, who leads the Syrian Revolutionaries Front, had said explicitly in the spring, I don't want to fight Jabhat al-Nusra. And he plays on this idea that, oh, they're native Syrians, they're our brothers, whereas IS are entirely a foreign organization, we want nothing to do with them. Now, with regards to the capacity of IS abroad, something I've looked into. One actually noticeable area where IS has presence is the Gaza Sinai area. They have a network called Jamaat Ansar ad-Dawlat al-Islamiyya fi Bayt al-Maqdis, which actually not only does dawah work, propaganda work for IS on the ground in Gaza, but what they also do is they send, they work as a supply network for IS in Syria. There's actually a Gazan contingent of fighters called the Sheikh Abu an-Nur al-Maqdisi Battalion, which is named after a Salafi sheikh in Gaza who opposed Hamas and got killed in 2009. On the other hand, though, you still have the Al-Qaeda affiliates. They still remain loyal to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Shabab in Somalia, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. In some respects, actually, the Caliphate Declaration didn't galvanize as many people as the Islamic State hoped. So by that I mean that people you would have associated with being pro-ISIS, when it was just ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Levant, and they came out giving statements saying we sympathize with them in the fight against the other rebels in Syria. When the actual Caliphate Declaration came, there wasn't this rush of new pledges of allegiance to the Caliphate. To give an example, Ansar al-Sharia, which is this jihadi network in Tunisia, has long been associated with being pro-ISIS. And actually one of their members had written a tract last year saying that it was obligatory on members of Jabhat al-Nusra, Syria's Al-Qaeda affiliate, to pledge allegiance to ISIS. When the actual Caliphate Declaration came out, Ansar Sharia Tunisia on its Facebook page shared a statement from Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb rejecting the Caliphate Declaration. But then at the same time, you have this disconnect between the leadership and then the people on the ground. You see, actually, ISIS is attracted, and what is now the Islamic State, is attracted a disproportionate number of Tunisians. And these are people on the ground who were associated with Ansar Sharia. They just go to Syria and Iraq. They go join the Islamic State. And also now you've got a split within the armed Tunisian jihadi insurgency, the Katiba Uqba ibn Nafi, which is a joint project between Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and Ansar al-Sharia Tunisia, where one of their provincial contingents has ended up actually declaring its support for the Islamic State as an actual caliphate. It's a contingent within central Tunisia in a place called Kairouan. On the other hand, in terms of the main problem that IS might pose is its supporters within the West. You definitely see in the English-speaking world of jihadis and so on, that particularly on social media, that IS is the one that attracts more support. They have much more articulate English advocates, English-speaking advocates within the West as opposed to Al-Qaeda. And it's in that capacity in which, say, someone who's supporting the Islamic State within the West might choose to now act on Adnani's declaration to go and attack Western targets.
Do you, Alia, I don't know if this is something you've studied or thought deeply about, but it's the brand. How effective, well, it has, I mean, it's a silly question really, it has been extraordinarily effective and snowballed. I wondered if you could just explore a bit of that, because it does appear to be a brand that has really kind of struck a chord in a way that Al-Qaeda never quite manage, particularly among Western supporters. Now, part of that may be just because there wasn't so much Twitter around 10 years ago, and so we weren't aware of the noise that was being created.
I think one of the reasons it's so powerful is because it's so controversial. Like, Baghdadi actually went there. He actually said he was the caliph, which is a massive affront to hundreds of years of theology, and even the evolution of the radical Islamist movement. Nobody else has dared do that, at least not Osama bin Laden, who was also a layman, and certainly wasn't a sort of in Abu Ghraib prison and a convicted rapist or whatever Baghdadi was. But yeah, so I think that it was the shock factor, and as a result, Firstly, as Ayman was saying, in the first instance, a lot of affiliated groups, the people that came out in support were, a group from the Philippines, Ansar ad-Din in Mali, because Iyad al-Ghali will support any way the wind is blowing and that sort of thing. And I think people were really shocked and biding their time. Then we had a group in Afghanistan, Hizb Islami, saying we're undecided, we're going to watch how things develop. And I think that that's what a number of affiliated groups will be doing, just seeing, as I use that phrase, which way the wind is blowing and then sort of casting their lot in. But the situation isn't static, because the fact of the caliphate, the fact Adnani has said in a very Bush-like way, you're either with us or against us, declare your allegiance and dissolve immediately or you're our enemies. It's creating splits within previously relatively more cohesive Al-Qaeda groups. So we talk about AQIM, we saw Drukdal's statement, it was very clear, he's with Zawahiri. But this kind of Qadi, this clerics released a statement about a month ago, it was a bit more ambiguous. And then a couple of days ago we have Jund al-Khalifa, this group that's emerged, announced itself, split off from the Algerian core of AQIM, and saying that Al-Qaeda has completely let it down and has created a number of mistakes, and we are arrows at the disposal of Baghdadi to use at his will. It was a couple of days ago. Then they kidnapped this Frenchman, and I believe he was beheaded today.
Yeah.
So, these things... So it's not just simply predefined groups reacting to a given situation. Both are sort of affecting and shaping each other. So we're going to see more splits emerging, and the dynamic it's unpredictable, but
Which could lead to...
But I think there's another, just over a very simple thing and going in ISIS' favour so far, which is victory. This is...
Yeah.
Well, that's just
Nothing
They win in
seems
Mosul,
like
they win in... they take Tikrit within a day, then they switch to Anbar, then, they defeat the Syrian army. The Syrian army suffered the worst defeats it suffered, I think, in 3 years of war in July, August. So I think victory, and then this appeals to this, all this is in the context of great numbers of bitter, angry Sunni young men in Syria and Iraq, their life pretty hopeless, and suddenly there's a victorious army they can join. And this is immensely appealing. I mean, somebody in the Iraqi National Security Agency told me that they had conducted a survey a few years ago of various areas where, I guess it was Al-Qaeda in Iraq at that moment, had taken over, and where 100 fighters had gone in. After a number of weeks, they could recruit 500 to 1,000. So by controlling this big area, which I think probably has a population of about 5 or 6 million, I mean, it's bigger size than Britain, they have a great recruiting base there. And that's what makes it so different from the old Al-Qaeda, which is sort of pitifully small by comparison.
If I could actually add about this perception of IS as a winning horse, particularly attractive on the domestic scene. If we look at Mosul, as I said, there was more than just IS. You will see the success of IS and the wealth it has, the weapons it has, and particularly actually on the domestic scene in Iraq, where you have others who might share this ideal of the caliphate, end up being subsumed by it. So there's a rival jihadi group in Iraq called Jamaat Ansar al-Islam, which is an outgrowth of what was an Al-Qaeda affiliate in Iraqi Kurdistan. It was called Ansar al-Islam. Now, they've had a dispute with IS over many years, going back to when it was the Islamic State of Iraq, because of the Islamic State's claim to be a state, which Jamaat Ansar al-Islam, which means group of Ansar al-Islam, does not accept. But since they have the end goal of a caliphate anyway, if there's already something calling itself the caliphate and it seems to be so successful, what's the point in being Jamaat Ansar al-Islam anymore? Might as well go join IS. So the group's actually been severely degraded in a number of areas of Iraq. They had batches of pledges of allegiance in Mosul throughout the summer, and where they've chosen not to pledge allegiance, they've either had to go underground, pretty much had to go underground, in Tikrit, for example.
I'm just going to, but I just feel we need to start getting some questions from the audience. We've got the microphones in circulation. Thank you, Millicent. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Tom Keating. I'm a finance and security analyst and an associate fellow at RUSI. One thing that has not really been mentioned at all in all this is financing. So I think everybody knows how finance has contributed to the growth of the Islamic State and the predecessor organizations, but it's being discussed as a way of nobbling the Islamic State. It's being discussed at the UN. Chuck Hagel has talked about it. What's the view of the panel on the role that money or depriving money will play?
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Bring the changes. Let's have. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, no, I think that perhaps, am I right in thinking the main
Mosul.
So they're sort of diversified, but
I think, I mean, I may have a slightly different view on this. I think that one positive consequence for ISIS coming out of this territorial strategy has been, as I said before, that they are the de facto state authority in these areas now. And we call it extortion because we don't like the group, but they are doing what the Iraqi or the Syrian government did before. They are taxing people. So they have reliable sources of income from within the territory, including the oil, including all sorts of other things. But most of their income, in fact, according to a RAND report, 95% of their income comes from within their territory, and most of that comes from taxing people. That is one of the big advantages of having a strategy that says, we're going to hold territory, we're going to govern that territory. You have income from within. You also have recruits from within. The negatives of that strategy are, of course, that whenever jihadists anywhere in the world have held territory for a very long time, they eventually became unpopular because whilst people may agree with the sort of harsh justice that they provide in the short term, they do not like the social program. I always, when Ayman always posts these pictures from Raqqa and from other places where they're burning cigarettes. I always wonder how that goes down in Iraq, you know? Telling people not to smoke, telling people not to watch movies, not to listen to music, etc. In the long term, that always backfires. So this holding territory strategy gives them a safe income, but it also has disadvantages in the long term.
I think they're linked because the safe income is actually predatory. And I think that that is also an alienating factor to be extorting,
as far as
seizing
taxing
property.
is predatory,
But
by
definition.
definition.
They're seizing property. They're, you know,
Sure,
it's
they're doing
beyond
that too, but they are doing a lot of the stuff that they are doing to raise money is what the government did before, which is to tax people.
We have
sorry, just on the oil question.
Oil.
The reason I raised it, I don't know if, so I suppose we're in dispute about whether it's the main source of income, but I think that whatever way, whatever the truth of the matter is that you have to work with Turkey on that, because I believe that most of the oil is smuggled through Turkey and bought by Turkish brokers. So I think that is, that if you're talking about choking them off financially, then Turkey is indispensable.
Clearly. The lady here, the woman, sorry. Not quite sure.
This woman's name is Shazadi Beg. I'm a barrister. It seems that the West has learned absolutely nothing from history. You know, we trained, armed, funded, glorified jihad during the Afghan war against the Soviets. Then we trained, armed, and funded the so-called moderate jihadists in Syria, and then we decided to bomb them. It seems to me that what is going on with IS is a sectarian issue at the heart of it. But why is it that we haven't actually challenged the religious narrative of the Islamic State? And if it is true that some of them are reading Islam for Dummies, why is it that we haven't actually challenged a lot of their belief system? Because many of the words that they use are seeped in Islamic history. And they talk about, for example, the battles during the time of the Prophet. But it seems to me that we don't challenge that. We remain with Saudi Arabia, despite all the history that I've just mentioned. We try to keep away from Iran, and Iran actually could be extremely important in defeating ISIS in Syria.
Patrick.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is a rather incredibly messy situation at the moment that, you have this so-called coalition that Kerry and Obama keep on going on about. But what's most of the members have in common is that they're not actually fighting ISIS. Even the Gulf monarchies that are supposed to have taken part in the first airstrikes, I mean, it's very unclear what they did. I think that, yeah, from the beginning, I think the whole support for the uprisings of 2011 in Libya and Syria and elsewhere on the part of Britain and America, it's always extraordinarily hypocritical that supposedly we supported secular democracy, but our main ally are the Gulf monarchies, which are the last theocratic absolute monarchies on earth. So there was, not surprisingly, they supported the jihadis. Now, the people who are actually fighting ISIS in Syria, you know, the Syrian army, or the Syrian Kurds, or Hezbollah, or Iraqi militias, if they haven't gone home, who are fighting them in Iraq. Well, it tends to be the militias rather than the army, the Shia militias, the Peshmerga, Iranians. You know, so it's this extraordinary disconnect between this supposed coalition that's meant to be fighting ISIS, but isn't actually fighting ISIS, and the people who we've demonized previously who are actually fighting ISIS. I don't mean this as to say they're a bunch of terrific fellows.
But there isn't you're sort of inching towards what it fascinates me is the gamble of these airstrikes, in that by risking appearing, if they don't simultaneously take on the Assad regime, there are two villages that have been occupied today, just on the outskirts of Aleppo, that were, or two positions rather, locations, that were Jabhat al-Nusra, that had been hit by American airstrikes and then occupied by Assad's army. Now, if that happens again and again, then it seems to me surely that one of the best ways to unite and ignite a very substantial Sunni backlash would be to be seen to be failing to intervene on the side of the Syrian revolutionaries at the beginning of the revolution, and then appearing to intervene on the side of the Assad regime once 200,000 people have died.
No, I don't agree at all. I think that at some point you have to choose what happens. You know, you have to choose. You know, most of the fighting has been today, I think, has been at Kobani, which is this Syrian Kurdish enclave on the Turkish border. Now, do the Americans use airstrikes to assist the Syrian Kurdish militia, the YPG, or do they, which is linked to the PKK in Turkey, which the Americans regard as a terrorist organization? But at some point you have to choose. Similarly with Assad, if there is another battle which between Assad's forces and ISIS, which ISIS is winning, as they did when they in Raqqa province recently,
around the airbase.
do the Americans do nothing, or do they attack ISIS, or do they attack the Syrian army? So at some point you have to choose there.
Hobson's choice. Yes, go on.
Respond to the point about Iran. Personally, I'm not at all, in principle, opposed to partnering with Iran or with anyone who wants to defeat ISIS. But there's three reasons why I'm quite skeptical about it. First of all, it won't happen. If you speak to anyone in Washington, D.C., they are not even remotely considering that. It is so far off the table. There's no realistic prospect of that happening. The second point is that the Americans are thinking, what are the Iranians actually bringing to the table? In theory, it sounds like a good idea. We both want to defeat ISIS. What do they bring? Do we need firepower from them? No, Americans have more than enough firepower. Do we need money? Do we need legitimacy from them? The feeling is that they are not bringing anything to the table that the Americans don't have already. And that brings me to the third and most important point. If the analysis that we've all put forward that is correct, that the support for ISIS in Sunni areas is driven by the fear of Shiites and the Iraqi government, and the Iraqi government, which is believed to be partnering and supported and a front for the Iranian government, do you think that it is a really clever idea to partner with the Iranian government? It is actually, if anything, going to harden Sunni people's resistance against sort of a new settlement in Iraq, if they believe that, in fact, this is a front for Iran. So I don't think it's a likely option. And if you're talking about people who have been driven into supporting ISIS by their fear of Shiites, then partnering with Iran is not going to solve that problem.
I don't think that the partnership with Iran would take the form of like holding hands with Khamenei
well,
and
tacit cooperation is happening already.
But it's not really a battlefield cooperation necessarily. I think what it would be working with Iran and engaging Iran on ending the conflict, on achieving at least a ceasefire in Syria. I think that's what we should talk about when we talk about engaging Iran, not
fighting ISIS.
I don't think we can't. No government likes to say, good morning, we're going to have a U-turn now. Nobody ever does that. The Americans aren't going to do that.
Yeah.
Secondly, do they have parallel policies? Do they have common interests? Yes. But also in Iraq, I mean, to my mind, even if every Sunni would still be saying, oh, it's a Salafid government, it wouldn't make much difference. As in Syria, a Sunni backlash, I mean, what have we got in Syria? We've had a Sunni backlash, in spades. I don't think there's much more backlash to come. We've already got it.
Well, you got more Sunnis than just in Syria. But let's have another question. Yes, sir, just caught my eye.
Hello, my name is Abdulaziz Al-Mashi. I am the co-founder of Syria Solidarity Movement. Actually, I think what's going on in the Middle East at the moment is a result to what's happening in Syria. Don't you believe that the main reasons for the growth and expanding of ISIS are, first, the lack of action from the international community towards the Syrian revolution, and the unjustified discrimination from the West to the Muslim Sunnis in both countries, Iraq and Syria?
Failure to act 2 years, 3 years ago.
Depends. They acted in Libya with airstrikes to help overthrow Gaddafi's regime, but you actually see what's happened there is that the central government can't even control the capital there, and you've had the growth of this Ansar Sharia movement in Libya, which has actually been an important supply of Libyan fighters to the Islamic State. Ansar Sharia Libya hasn't openly declared allegiance to the Islamic State, but like Ansar Sharia Tunisia, a lot of its ground members are pro-IS. They go and join IS, and actually there's a Libyan contingent in Syria and Iraq. It's called Katiba al-Bitar al-Libi. Played an important role in the fighting in eastern Syria to help consolidate IS's control. Now Libya, of course, there was an intervention, and people would just think, well, it'll sort itself out. And even the Western powers provided some training for a new Libyan army outside the country, but it's what's happened there. Now Syria, I think there's always been this problem of localization and division, and I don't see why Syrians are any more prone to uniting, say, than in Libya. For example, I mean, I've looked at many towns that fell out of government control in Syria, and you'd find there are multiple factions, and you just think, why is that? Why are there multiple factions? Why can't they all just, put aside their differences? And actually, this division, this extent of division, is something that's allowed IS also to consolidate its control. Yes, we talk about Sunni feeling of marginalization in the hands of non-Sunnis, but there were other things that IS brought to areas that they've now taken that some of the inhabitants welcomed. I mean, this problem of division and so on, say rivals attacking each other within a given locality. If there's just IS, then yes, it's authoritarian, but at least, there's some kind of feeling of safety. And then, of course, also, when you have multiple factions in a given locality, say, out of government control, warlordism becomes very rampant, and then IS can come along and, say, stamp that out. Again, authoritarian, very brutal, but, at least you don't have corrupt warlords roaming around all over the place. In terms of intervening, I think it's very naive to think you can just intervene from outside with airstrikes and give weapons to those you like, and that therefore something will sort itself out. If your idea from the beginning was to help overthrow the Assad government militarily, using airstrikes and supplying those you want to help them win, you still have the aftermath. And if IS thrives on an environment of chaos, surely in a post-Assad order where things are ripe for division and chaos is ongoing. As I actually felt even back in 2012, if the government were to fall that year, you'd have chaos enduring for many years. IS can take advantage of that if you don't have people on the ground, try to help rebuild the nation in terms of training a new army to help bring stability and so on.
I've thought about this a long time, and I can admit freely that I've changed my positions repeatedly on this particular issue. So don't hold it against me, because it is a very hard question. I do think, and this is my current position, that in 2012 there was a window of opportunity to go in and massively support what was in existence at that point, which was, of course, conservative Sunni Muslims, but still a fairly moderate opposition that was willing to engage in a sort of post-conflict Syria that would have accommodated minorities and would have moved towards democracy. And what you've seen is, because the support from the West was not forthcoming, I can give you numerous examples of people we saw on YouTube that were completely clean-shaven, and once the Saudi money started coming in, they all grew beards, they all changed the logos of their group to something Islamic, and they started spouting that kind of rhetoric. It had an immediate effect because they were not getting support from the West. And you can see that also in statements from groups that really changed their tune very much in accordance with the support they are getting. I understand in 2012 it was difficult for President Obama because it was an election year, and no one, neither Obama nor Romney, wanted to commit to another intervention in the Middle East, which was very unpopular. But I think once he got re-elected, that's where the window of opportunity was. I think in those 3, 4, 5 months, something could have changed. Now I think it is probably too late.
But Patrick probably doesn't agree. I don't agree. Because, I think there was a moment, I was in Damascus in 2012, and there was a moment where maybe the Assad government was sort of wavering, although it was beginning to get support from Russia and Iran, might have gone down. What would have happened then? I think, as Ayman said, Libya. There's no reason to suppose that these rather inchoate groups that opposed the government at that time would have been able to replace it. What you could have had the Assad government. If it had gone down, there would have been a vacuum, much like we've seen in Libya, and I think with similar results.
Yeah, I think it's just answer. I mean, why are you citing what the failed style of Libya and not the success of the Sahawat in Iraq in 2006? You remember in Iraq, even the American army failed to defeat the Islamic State in that time. And what happened? Sahawat, who were Muslim Sunni tribes, they took on Al-Qaeda and they managed to defeat it. This is the reality. And what the American did, they hand Iraq over to the Iranian, and Al-Maliki, he went far away of his discrimination against the Muslim Sunni in Iraq. Even in Syria, I mean, look at the international community, how they deal with the situation. They are talking about ISIS, and they don't talk about Hezbollah, who is a Shiite, who is supporting Assad, and who committed atrocity against the people of Al-Qusayr near Damascus. I mean, even now, look at it. It is intervention now. It is too late. And if you go to 2012, the Islamic State wasn't even exist in Syria. The Islamic State emerged late, like I would say November and December 2012. The Syrian people started their revolution peacefully. They were abandoned by the international community. And again, it is only the Sunni people who can defeat terrorism in the Middle East. This is the reality, and we have to face it.
Well, I don't think there's any dispute, really, I think one of the interesting things about this panel would be in agreement with you on precisely that point. That's what the opening statements were all, I think, in alliance, suggesting that if there is going to be some kind of solution, it has to be political and it has to be Sunni-led. This is a Sunni problem, and indeed, Ayman even cited the so-called awakening program. But thank you for you. Certainly there.
Hi, thanks. First, thanks to the panelists. It was really fascinating. My name is Jonathan Pecha. I'm the Middle East watcher at the U.S. Embassy. So if you'll allow me 30 seconds, perhaps, to wave the flag just a bit. And I say this with...
You've got to ask a question. We're not having statements.
No, I absolutely have a question. With 367 days of bringing peace, stability, and democracy to the people of Iraq, as Ayman pointed out, we don't do this stuff very well. humbly. Also, I would just say that we haven't abandoned the people of Syria. For both the U.S. and the UK, there's been training and equipping now of $500 million for the Syrian army. We poured in belatedly, but we've been doing stuff already.
So what's your question?
Question I'd actually like to shift the focus. The build as a tactics panel. The foreign fighter inflow, particularly from European countries. What is it about IS, or what is it about these diaspora communities in the UK and in Europe that is making them susceptible and vulnerable to this kind of brainwashing, that they're willing to leave communities in Western Europe to go into battle spaces in Syria and Iraq?
I'll start with, a brief one, if you will, and also I wanted to sort of add to that. Do you see any connection between the so-called foreign fighters, the British volunteers in particular, and the very substantial Kashmiri community in this country?
Okay.
Just throw that little grenade into your lap.
Well, I mean, in the end, if you look at the numbers, it's still a very, very small proportion of European Muslims. France, there are many millions of Muslims, and also UK, you have a few million Muslims, but numbers are still only going into the hundreds. So that, on the basis of that, I actually do think, there is something about this ideological narrative the Islamic State has constructed that foreign fighters find appealing, and this is why most of the foreign fighters end up joining the Islamic State. The Islamic State, even when it was just ISIS, and therefore implied a geographical space, a limited geographical space in which it was operating, nonetheless began in 2013. It began putting out this open messaging about eventually an Islamic State over the entire world. I remember, and also, of course, projecting in advance this caliphate declaration, which really showed what they were getting at, which was really a project independent of Al-Qaeda, even as it was months before that official statement from Al-Qaeda saying that there was no relation between the two. But the point is, the global emphasis and also this idea of building the state and implementing the Sharia, something that these ideologues who've come over into Syria and Iraq find particularly appealing. Unfortunately, I don't know enough to comment on the ethnic connection of Kashmiris in the UK. And,
well, no, I mean, because there is quite a lot of because of the long years. It may sound racist, but it's actually very well informed. There is Lashkar-e-Taiba. Pakistan has been using this form of ideology and a methodology of brainwashing of young people for generations in Kashmir to create militant groups to go and fight across the, it's not a border, I'm not quite sure what the politically correct term is, line of demarcation between the two countries. So I was just wondering whether the academics here had sort of picked any of that up. But Peter?
Yeah. So in response to your question, so we've been following this phenomenon for over 2 years, and we've constructed a database at my center that now contains the online social media profiles of nearly 500 foreign fighters, Western foreign fighters who are currently in Syria. This gives us a lot of information, and in a few dozen cases, it has actually enabled us to talk to these guys through Facebook, through WhatsApp, etc. So I think, and this is where I have my little grievance with other people who are talking about this topic, we are actually one of the few people who are actually talking to these guys. And what they are telling us, and what you can get from their communication, is that there's a mix of motives. I think a lot of people went over in 2012 and early 2013 were primarily motivated by humanitarian reasons. They heard news about Bashar Assad torturing, killing, raping. There's a genocide going on in Syria. We need your help now. These are a lot of people who came over on humanitarian convoys. And amongst these people, and you may have read the sort of Times front page 2 weeks ago, where we talked about some of the people who contacted us and who say, we want to come back because we feel we're being trapped in a situation that we didn't sign up for. And these are typically people that came over in the first wave. The people who came over more recently, they are people who are more falling into Ayman's description. certainly since the declaration of the Islamic State, the idea of building a caliphate, that's a more ideological motivation, but it is also something that excites some people because they are saying, I can be part of a historical project. In 1,000 years' time, people will still talk about those young, brave Westerners who came over and built the new caliphate. And that is something that we're hearing a lot now that we didn't hear in 2012. But just as a last point, there's definitely also, besides all these points about identity and ideology and religion, there's also this idea of adventure. And people go over because it's brotherhood, it's heroism, it's fighting, it's having guns. And in 2013, for a long time, there was a Twitter hashtag called the 5-Star Jihad, where people posted pictures of them playing snooker with guns, hanging out at the swimming pool, basically like an adventure holiday minus the alcohol. Pretty much like the Frontline Club tonight, right? But that certainly plays a role for young men in particular too. So these are the sort of themes that we're seeing.
Did you want to contribute?
Well, I didn't want to answer the question initially because Peter's written all of these studies, but I just wanted to add that I think that the narrative is increasingly utopian, and I think the reality is fundamentally sort of dystopian, and I think we have to make more of that contrast, I think, in our information campaigns. I think that was it.
Good.
Sorry, can I just ask a question of him? What, all this publicity about foreign fighters, what proportion of ISIS fighters do you think are foreigners?
40%. 40%, I would say.
I would put it similar to Peter. I actually think the sometimes there's been this overstatement, the majority of IS are foreign fighters. Now on the front lines, maybe actually you could put it like a 50-50 mix, and then there are foreign fighters who've been important to what IS does on the battlefield, particularly the Libyans and the ones.
Yeah.
But same time, IS has always been more than just someone who's fighting on the front lines. When people give bay'ah to ISIS or allegiance to ISIS, it can be tribesmen, people provide public services, and that's always been important to ISIS, in Syria in particular. So actually, when I wrote for the BBC on this topic of rebel groups or groups that pull in foreign fighters in Syria, I was careful nonetheless to stress that I still think, in my estimation, the majority were still Syrians, actually, rather than, and apply the same situation to Iraq as well, actually, but of course in Iraq, much longer history, much more, even more of a native component.
But it's a surprisingly high figure for 40%. It's a pretty
How far,
impressive.
how many of these are sort of effective fighters? I mean, most Iraqi young men, know how to use a weapon from early on. Somebody from Manchester doesn't. So there are obviously units and brigades of foreigners who are very, very effective, have fanaticism and military expertise. But there must be others who are pretty useless.
So if you have, it depends on where they are coming from. So you, of course, is very famous, the Chechens who've come, Libyans, etc. They are good fighters, no doubt, and they are allowed to fight. A lot of the Europeans are useless at fighting. They often haven't shot a gun in their lives. And for them, there are essentially three options. So either they have a skill that is useful to ISIS regardless. So if you are a mechanic in London, you can be a mechanic for ISIS. That's useful. That's what a military organization needs. If you're good at video editing, media and outreach, that is obviously something that you can do, and all that English language propaganda that Damon talked about is of course produced by foreign fighters who are not fighting a lot, but who are part of ISIS. But if you don't have any military qualifications, you don't have any skill, you're not good at media and outreach, what is left? What is left is that you're used as a suicide bomber, that you're used for excessively brutal operations, and it is no accident that in the 2000s in Iraq, and now again in Syria and Iraq, almost all the suicide operations are being carried out by foreigners.
Right, fascinating. Gentleman right at the back there. Yeah. Sorry, I forgot.
If I can just add to what that lady said over there, I'm afraid I'm going to go a bit further and probably irritate all of you and say that...
Well, can you do it in a form of a question?
Yes, I will. Do you not think that the BBC has been remiss in its duties to be more truthful in its reporting? I have tons of books here which will seem conspiracy. One is Secret Affairs by Mark Curtis. I have another one, Web of Deceit. I have another one by Ian John Pilger did the
in Ian Cobain, Cruel Britannia. And I will tell, this is The Strange Death of Dr. David Kelly by Norman Baker, MP. This is the London bombings, and so on and so forth.
I hope you didn't bring your whole library.
I have read, and
we get it.
I'm just saying that it seems to me that ISIS, whatever that means, and it keeps changing its meaning, is being funded by, as you've all said yourselves, the oil cartel and by Western intelligence.
No, we didn't say that.
I'm saying that, and if it was, and it has a long history from Edward Bullier Lytton, Benjamin Disraeli, Lord Palmerston, who helped set up in the 1920s the Muslim Brotherhood with.
Sorry, can you put it in a question?
Yeah.
Keep it short, please.
Okay, I'm just saying, do you not feel the BBC is no longer reporting news, but is acting as propaganda? And if we all found out the truth, basically we'd switch off and we'd watch alternative media, which is now telling the truth.
Okay, well, obviously, ringing endorsement there subliminally for Sky, but nonetheless. Conspiracy theory?
Patrick.
No. I think media coverage of Syria, not that good, partly for practical reasons. It's very difficult to cover a place where so many factions are going to kidnap you or chop your head off. Mistakes by the media, to my mind, romanticization of rebels, the rebel movements in Syria and Libya, was pretty pervasive for a time, less now. I think also, I mean, it wasn't really a question, so this isn't really an answer, but you know, one thing that did strike me all along until recently is how people knew in the media or elsewhere might know about Syria, or diplomats, politicians, they might know about Iraq. They seldom knew, a lot of them didn't know about both and realize how ISIS would, developing in Iraq, would use that strength in Syria, would come back to Iraq, the enormous advantages it had in operating in two very different political environments.
Yeah.
I think that there has been a lack. I think the BBC is much worse on Gaza and sort of political, but I think on Syria, I don't know what side it's not presenting. But I think one thing that hasn't been emphasized enough is the connection between what we're seeing now and the rise of ISIS and the Iraq War, the invasion and occupation of Iraq. And I think we can draw, I don't know if the other panelists agree, but I think we can draw a straight line between that and the rise of ISIS. And I find it almost upsetting when people talk about Syria, what's happening in Syria, destabilizing Iraq, when in actual fact, a lot of these militants that flooded into Syria and helped to militarize so spectacularly the Syrian revolution had cut their teeth in the Iraqi insurgency and had also taken territory and been the kind of forebear for the sort of ISIS caliphate that we're seeing now. And actually that's why we have a nationalist kind of caliphate, territorial focused version of Al-Qaeda now in Syria and Iraq, is because these guys had cut their teeth as insurgents trying to take and hold territory in the war against US troops in Iraq. So I think that more perhaps needs to be made of that link, and we shouldn't underplay it.
Good. This lady here.
Should we take a group of questions?
A group of questions. Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much. I kind of wanted to go off of the motivation of foreign fighters. We've heard a lot about that, but what about the motivation of women who are going into ISIS? It's unlike what we saw with Al-Qaeda, so I'd really love to hear what you think about that.
Okay, that's a good one. We'll bank that. Why do women join ISIS? It's the
Thank
outfits.
you. I'm Paul Raymond. I'm Middle East editor at Newsfixed. We've obviously talked a lot about the threat to Western countries. I'm wondering, the governments such as the Egyptian government and the Tunisian government, Adnani, one of the spokespeople of ISIS, made a statement a couple of days ago saying, encouraging Ansar Beit al-Maqdis in the Sinai to keep on chopping the heads off the Egyptian security forces, as I'm sure Ayman will have much more to say about that. To what extent are those declarations of allegiance and sort of the inspiration that the jihadist groups across North Africa are clearly taking from ISIS, to what extent is all that actually going to have an effect on the ground in those countries, particularly in Tunisia and Egypt?
Okay, good. We'll bank that one. The extent of the ISIS brand spreading. Yes, sir. We'll take the third one, then we'll crash them all in.
Hi, I'm Hamid Mahdi from the BBC.
Shame on you.
I think one of the things that the panel's mostly agreed on is the fact that ISIS, for much of its existence, has been more preoccupied with fighting the near, the further enemy. And obviously that's changed after US airstrikes on the group. Isn't it the case that we've created an enemy now where there wasn't one before by intervening?
Right, hold that thought. I'm going to ask Patrick, because we touched on that, and I don't think your position will change. Starting with the first question, are airstrikes creating an enemy that didn't exist before? And then just to remind you, why do women join? And
I don't know,
how fast is ISIS going to metastasize?
I think that, airstrikes, yeah, I mean, to some extent, they have an effect. They probably contain ISIS, but it's difficult to have columns of vehicles advancing down roads to Erbil or towards Aleppo, or if the other side can call in airstrikes. ISIS seems to be reverting in Iraq to more guerrilla-type war, which air power is much less effective. Is there a reaction to it? Will there be a reaction to it? Yes, that will happen as well. I mean, my own feeling is that one thing that hasn't been done, which isn't necessarily a replacement of other policies, but should be side by side with it, is stopping the war in Syria insofar as it can be done by local ceasefires, I mentioned, between so-called moderate units and the Assad government. Because, ISIS flourishes in conditions of war. It is sort of a war machine. It has an ideology. We have many other things that we've spoken about. It's basically a war machine and is very good at it. So long as the war goes on, that's a situation that ISIS can deal with. If you can reduce the level of violence, if you can reduce that war, then the situation is much less conducive to ISIS flourishing as it does in the moment in Syria and Iraq. What was the other question?
Why do women join?
I said I didn't know.
I'll do that one.
You're not a woman.
No, I know, but I followed this long now. No, actually, it's interesting that the Islamic State has actually actively set up its own projects to incorporate women into their role in the state. For example, there's the Khatib al-Khansa in Raqqa, which actually I only learned about in the first place by pro-regime sources, and it turned out to be true. So, if someone wants to talk about media coverage, sometimes I think, not enough value is given to pro-regime sources. But anyway, they help enforce the wearing of niqab, for example, and that's been a big part of IS messaging in Raqqa since last year about the importance of hijab shara'i, hijab according to Sharia, and now these pictures of women completely covered and say, ihtishami sir jamali, my modesty is the secret of my beauty, referring to being completely covered. And now it's become the norm in Raqqa now, and this is the model that IS seeks to implement anywhere, and in that respect they can get women to run the enforcement of that. And now women joining IS, the foreign women joining IS, I think they're even more ideological than the male recruits, because I think Peter was right that some of the early foreign fighters who came did have this humanitarian motivation, but this women thing is a more recent phenomenon, and that's definitely a lot more ideological just generally. And that's saying something.
It's actually something that we've seen even before Syria. I mean, certainly in the case of Syria, you're now seeing some Western European countries are recruiting maybe 10 or 15% of the foreign fighters that are going from Sweden or from other Scandinavian countries are women. Now, if you studied homegrown jihadism 10 or 15 years ago, it would have been very unusual to see any women whatsoever, and typically the women you saw were married to a jihadist. That was their route into that particular movement. Now you do see two girls from Portsmouth just going off on their own, two girls from Austria, 17 and 19, doing this on their own. I think the explanation is ultimately the internet. which really allows women to get involved in a movement that on a face-to-face basis they would have extreme difficulty of getting involved in. But through the internet, they can engage with fighters, they can go and ask them, they can start getting involved and get to the point where they're motivated enough to go. And that's, I think, why we're seeing this phenomenon stronger than before now.
I'm no expert, but I think you're a woman.
I'm not attracted to ISIS, but, you know.
Well, why haven't you joined? No, but is it this? It is an irony, though, isn't it, that they particularly from the West, women are signing up to join a movement that is extremely misogynistic, in my view. Wouldn't look you in the eye, wouldn't shake your hand, or any of those things. They're signing up for some kind of what to a Western eye looks like purgatory.
Well, it's part, I think, of this coup de théâtre by kind of declaring a caliphate. I think the notion of hijrah and having an obligation to migrate to a truly Islamic land has been part of the kind of discourse that's aimed at women. And again, that's part of the kind of utopian element and wanting to be a part of history. So I think it's the fact that ISIS builds itself as, like, you know, a foundational kind of Islamic community in ways that other groups haven't done before. And that's inherently attracted to women who interpret their faith a certain way and look back at certain, you know, Islamic precedents or, you know, invented notions of Islamic duty. So I think that the notion of hijrah is probably part of the explanation in the sort of heightened female presence there, and of course the internet.
Brilliant. I know that there are probably many more questions, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to draw proceedings to a close. Millicent's been tapping her watch for about... Oh, I did promise you your question.
Yeah.
Oh, no, what was your question? I can't remember now.
It was about about North Africa.
Yeah,
just to mention, so the as I say, the IS network in Gaza and Sinai is Jamaat and Ansar al-Islamiyya fi Bayt al-Maqdis, but you also touched on Jamaat and Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis, which is a different group. There's evidence they've been working with IS, but they seem to have this incoherent position like Ansar Sharia Tunisia, where they don't want to step in and pledge outright allegiance, but they want to be sympathetic nonetheless. I mean, you saw actually in Ansar Sharia's Eid al-Fitr message, where they extended tribute to both Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and Ain al-Zawahiri. But how can you do that if the Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is demanding you pledge allegiance to him, and then you don't pledge allegiance? I mean, they apparently there's been sharing of bomb-making techniques and so on, and I think that could have an impact. And, you know, in the long run, of course, one reason why the Islamic State places so much emphasis on outreach to children is that's the way to perpetuate itself. They reach out to the next native generation in Syria and Iraq, and they know that the foreign fighters aren't necessarily going to stay forever. Although I'm sure a large number of them would really like to stay and continue fighting out and die in their caliphate. But it's certainly there's this question of if they return to their own lands of Libya and Iraq, Libya and Tunisia, sorry. Are they going to go influence the landscape there and shift it in even more IS-leaning direction? It's possible.
Great. Thank you all very much for coming. I hope our panel has provided, I'm sure our panel has provided a great deal of food for thought for what I fear, as Barack Obama and David Cameron keep repeating, this is an issue, albeit a problem, that's going to be around for at least a generation. What a terrible thing to bequeath to our children alongside global warming and population expansion. It's all time to learn to sail and shoot, I think. But so that just remains now for me to thank our very distinguished panel, Patrick, Peter, Alia and Ayman, for coming in and so enlightening us. Thank you so much.